Hello everyone, welcome again to my philosophy channel. Now in this video, I would like to consider a subject I deem fundamental to a good life, and that is the ability to recognize good arguments. So before we unpack this further, let's first clarify what we mean by this. When we refer to the skills of argument, we are not describing a person's ability to be argumentative. So argumentative people, as we all know, are those who are typically capable of overcoming their opponents in a discussion or a debate by deferring to their emotions. They use a process of emotional reasoning by appealing to how they feel as the basis for making their points. And regrettably, this is too often confused with the skills of argument. So where argumentative people are relying on their feelings, the skills of argument rely on rules of logic. Logic is derived from the term logos, which in classical Greek terms describes a process by which appeals are made to the audience's reason in order to build up arguments from the bottom up. So the skills of argument are in turn composed of four main modes of logical reasoning, and these are namely deductive, inductive, abductive, and analogous reasoning methods. And we'll consider each of these in turn. But before we do, let's briefly reflect on the value of argument to contemporary society and consider why we should strive to become better at it and better at recognizing what it constitutes. So first, what is the value of political discussion in society? And what place does good reasoning hold in all of this? The French writer Voltaire once famously stated, "I despise what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." The quote is revealing of a larger point, and that's the fundamental value of political discourse to a free society. A philosophical commitment to free speech is therefore predicated on this notion that free speech is a fundamental right we have by virtue of being human in a collective society, and thus is in and of itself essential to the proper workings of a democratic society. In order to get to the present day where freedom of speech is largely taken for granted, it serves to be reminded of the blood of the millions that were shed in order for us to get here today. So when we speak of political discussion, we are often presupposing to some extent that the majority of the participants, and we'll call them interlocutors, have some sense of what it means to have a cogent argument. In other words, we assume that when we exercise our right to free speech, we are engaging in a constructive exercise that draws us closer to a specific end. So that's whether that be an objective truth, a compromise on certain points, or even simply a consensus to respectfully disagree. There is something reciprocal and something constructive about this activity. So I believe this is what Voltaire was assuming when he offered up his life to protect his opponent's right to speak freely. So in this video, I'll be working on the assumption that political dialogue is a vital part of a free and tolerant society. However, like anything else, political dialogue can be done well or it can be done badly. And if done well, we should find the particular dialogue coming from our interlocutor compelling. However, we live in an era of social media where we are consistently inundated with information, and good reasoning seems far and few between. In fact, we don't even require it in some cases. So in the same vein, it shouldn't come as much of a surprise that most of this seemingly infinite supply of information is poorly reasoned or not reasoned at all. And this problem worsens where social media becomes a major platform for political discussion and debate. Where skills of argument and reasoning are in decline, we begin to see a mass proliferation of baseless claims that still tug at the heartstrings and then become accepted as unquestioned truths. And herein lies the danger of fake news. It's in our increasing inability to discern the difference between bad arguments and good ones. So what amounts to a good argument, do you think? The method of argument can be traced back 2,500 years to the classical Athenian philosopher Socrates. Now, I think most of you would have come across some stories of Socrates, and he was famous for many things. For cutting an eccentric and controversial figure, for allegedly having poor hygiene habits, troubles with his wife, amongst other things. Socrates was well known in life, mostly though, for probing his interlocutor buddies for the reasons for their claims. And the method of argument that he comes up with, which involves asking questions to find answers, is aptly named after him. It's the Socratic Method. On this point, it is of course important to remember that philosophy, by its very nature, involves the process of questioning any knowledge claim. Now, this process invariably involves a degree of skepticism. The classical Greek meaning of skeptikos referred to an inquirer, someone who is not satisfied with any given information, but is still in search of the truth. The following is an example of the Socratic method, and it's a dialogue that took place between Socrates and his friend Euthyphro, which appears in the Plato's dialogue by the same name, Euthyphro. So Socrates invites Euthyphro into a dialogue about the nature of piety. And he does it through this method of flattery. So he flatters his opponent, lulls him into a sense of confidence or security so that he can draw him into a discussion. And Euthyphro states that something is pious because it is loved by the gods. Socrates then asks his first question: is piety the opposite of impiety? Euthyphro agrees that they are indeed opposites. Socrates then asks, do the gods disagree about what is good and what is pious? Because the gods often disagreed. Euthyphro says yes. So Socrates asks, so one action can be loved by some gods and hated by others. Euthyphro has to at this point say yes, but realizes also his dilemma, that his conclusion does not follow on from his original premise. The interlocutor is thus defeated on logic based on his own premise. So going back to the contemporary social media culture that surrounds us, this culture stands at stark odds with this process of Socratic reasoning, which involves sifting wheat from chaff. So it's about asking questions to draw nearer to the truth and to be able to filter all those things that don't stand up to reason. So where philosophy traditionally involves the process of questioning whether certain claims are true by examining the purported rational grounds or accepted assumptions on which they're made, present ideological and cultural wars are staged on social media platforms where logic is violently dismissed and replaced by feelings. And on that note, let's turn to consider the different modes of reasoning we need to be able to master or know about to identify logical errors and ask better questions of our interlocutors. The first is the method of deductive reasoning. So in epistemological terms, we can come to know things directly or through reasoning. And the first kind of reasoning is deductive. So suppose I know Peter and his son, Stefan, and one day I meet Peter and he introduces me to his sister, Mary. So the next time I catch up with Stefan, I might ask him about his Aunt Mary. Nobody actually told me that Mary was Stefan's aunt. I simply inferred it. And like many of us, I learned about the basic rule of filial relations, that the sister of a parent is also the aunt of their children. Consider hypothetically if we were not able to use this type of reasoning. So we could not make any inferences of any kind. Having a normal, straightforward discussion would be quite difficult if you could not make inferences or expect your interlocutor to make logical inferences. So reasoning from general rules to their specific inferences is a commonly used reasoning tool. Deductive reasoning is thus the name for the type of logical reasoning which involves inferring something from a general rule of fact. And it's quite important in daily life. So in this context, logical reasoning is what we more broadly describe as the process by which we make valid arguments and avoid logical fallacies as far as that is possible, it is also the key to a rational thinking. Now, rational thinking involves a premise that follows through to its logical conclusion, and there is a coherence about the whole discussion or the whole line of reasoning. So, for example, say the thesis statement is, if there is an A on the card, then there is a 2 on the card. So the premise is, if there is an A, there is an A on the card, and the conclusion that would follow would therefore be, there is a 2 on the card. So if we hold X, then Y should follow, and it is called an if-then statement because it's a conditional one. If the premise holds, then the conclusion follows. However, studies have shown that most people are influenced by the content of the example rather than the logical inference. So once you start to plug in a real life example into that particular logical methodology, find people get easily distracted and defer to emotional reasoning as opposed to logical reasoning. An example that was used in a study is, if childcare workers' pay is increased, then recruitment to the profession will fall. And that's the thesis. The premise was childcare workers' pay is increased. The conclusion that follows, therefore, is that recruitment to the profession will fall. And the study found that when such a conditional statement was presented for logical evaluation, many people did not believe the conditional statement to be true, as they thought in their minds that increasing the pay ought to, if anything, increase recruitment to the profession. Now, studies have also shown that when university students are given the same problem like this, many refuse to endorse the conclusion that the rational one or the logical one that follows. In fact, this is true of my own experience as a law lecturer. Where strong logical reasoning instructions are given, those with higher IQ will still answer that the conclusion does follow after all, regardless of their personal beliefs. Those with lower IQs mostly stick with what they believe rather than adhere to logic. So deductive reasoning holds a special place in philosophy ever since Plato, and Aristotle further developed it in his works in prior analytics. In modern times, this form of reasoning has largely fallen from favor and become the exception rather than the rule, though in philosophy it still holds priority. Let's move on to our second type of logical reasoning, and that's inductive reasoning. Now, inductive reasoning involves arguments where observations about past instances and regularities lead to a conclusion about future instances and general principles. So, an example is, the fact that the sun has risen in the east every single day of our lives to date leads us to the conclusion that it will rise in the east again tomorrow, and to the general principle that the sun always rises in the east. In a good, cogent inductive argument, the truth of the thesis statement provides some degree of support for the truth of the conclusion. Now, in contrast with a deductive method, an inductive method relies on the degree of support it will receive from data, evidence, and thus the argument itself will never be maximal purely on the basis of logic. So, for example, because it moves from specific observations to general ones, there is always the possibility that the conclusions might prove false at a later date. And that is, given enough data, there may always be the possibility that the thesis may not hold true. And this is because rather than going from a general to specific, like deductive reasoning method, they're going from the observed to the unobserved, so the reverse. So inductive reasoning is mostly recognized in the fields of science and medical studies, which involve empiricism. Abductive reasoning. Now, an abductive argument like deductive reasoning seeks theories of specific events to explain a conclusion. Unlike inductive reasoning, the conclusion drawn through an inductive reasoning process are based on guesswork. So under this, it's assumed that the most probable conclusion is the most valid one. And an example of inductive reasoning is, Say the thesis statement is the flamingos here are all pink. And then the premise is all flamingos I've ever seen are pink. And the conclusion is all flamingos must be pink. And this type of reasoning is most typically used in the context of uncertainty. So you can take your best guess or ballparking. It is a form of calculated or educated guessing. For example, in exams, it is good practice to answer all the questions, even those questions you're not sure about. And this is because attempting all the questions gives you a better chance of choosing the most probable answer. So this brings us to our last method of logical reasoning, and that's analogical reasoning. So arguments by analogy are based on the idea that if two things are similar, then what is true of one is most likely true of the other also. Legal reasoning in especially common law countries use analogical reasoning widely through the system of precedent. So say C1 is similar to C2 in certain known respects. C1 has some further feature Y. Therefore, C2 also has feature Y or some feature Y star, similar to Y. The first premise establishes the analogies between these two situations, while the second premise states that the source domain, which is C1, has a given property. The conclusion, so Y. The conclusion which follows then is that the target domain, C2, also has the property of a suitable counterpart thereof, Y star. And now analogical arguments are present in all known philosophical traditions, including traditions like ancient Greek, Chinese, and Indian. For instance, in Plato's dialogue in the Gorgias, the knack of rhetoric is compared to pastry baking, both seductive but unhealthy, whereas philosophy would correspond more closely to medicine. Both have the features of being potentially painful and unpleasant, but good for the soul or body. Analogical thinking continues to occupy a central position in philosophical discussions. However, if there is any weakness, it is that though the property of two things, the source domain and the target domain, may be similar, this may not be sufficient to extrapolate the property of the source domain onto the target domain. So though it possesses a lesser degree of conviction than the previous three kinds of arguments discussed, it will remain a common form of logical reasoning that appears that you encounter in your daily lives and in your professional lives. So to conclude, the usefulness of knowing the four modes of logical reasoning for better, having better arguments and also recognizing what constitutes a good argument as opposed to a bad one is that firstly, they draw us closer to the truth. When we're able to check that our conclusions follow logically from our premise and do the same for our interlocutors, we are able to have constructive dialogues. Secondly, it enables us to detect the fallacy in other people's arguments and therefore improves our filter for detecting good arguments versus bad ones. And thirdly, it gives us a sense of intellectual modesty. And this is quite important because this kind of skepticism and humility is fundamental to a life that examines yourself and examines the evidence that's brought before you. So the information that needs to be assessed. Socrates once said, "I'm the wisest man alive." And his reasoning for this was, I know one thing, and that one thing is that I know nothing. And this statement seems ironic at first, but is far from laughable. Now, Socrates was the wisest man on earth because he recognized his own ignorance. And this is its own kind of wisdom because the act of suspending judgment motivated him to continue asking questions. He did have certain invincible convictions though, so it doesn't mean throw the baby out with the bathwater. For one, he believed that an unexamined life was not worth living. It's therefore here that I will end this video because I think that's a great time for us to consider and reflect on the skills of argument and the importance of asking questions of ourselves and of our surroundings to further our pursuit of truth. Thank you for joining me, and I hope to visit you again with new videos shortly.